Imagine this: a tense neighborhood, a missing officer, and a seemingly innocent tent set up for a search operation. But then an HOA Karen shows up, demanding the tent be taken down, not realizing the gravity of the situation. What happens next will leave you stunned. It all started when the local police set up a command center in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a tent serving as the base for a search effort for a missing officer. People in the area were worried, wondering what was going on, but the situation was far more serious than anyone knew. The family, the friends, and the community had come together, hoping to bring someone home. But that's when the HOA Karen, a resident who's more concerned about the rules than the emergency unfolding right in front of her, decided to step in. She showed up with a clipboard and a mission. The tent had to go, no exceptions. As tensions rose, the people around her tried to explain the situation, but she was insistent, unaware that this wasn't just a random tent, it was the lifeline for finding a missing officer. As the confrontation heated up, would the HOA Karen back down or cause even more chaos? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. The HOA Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules, she had a reputation in the neighborhood for being overly controlling. She was the type of person who would report the smallest violation, from lawn decorations to a misplaced trash can. But this situation was different. As she walked up to the tent, clipboard in hand, her tone was sharp, almost mocking. "This is a residential area. You can't just put a tent up like this without permission," she demanded, looking around to make sure others were listening. The people at the tent, mostly volunteers and a few officers, were clearly on edge. They were working tirelessly to coordinate the search for Officer Harris, a well-liked officer who had gone missing during a dangerous operation just days before. His colleagues, some of whom were stationed at the tent, were trying to stay focused, but the stress was taking its toll. Every minute mattered, and here was this woman, arguing about permits and bylaws, completely oblivious to the life-or-death situation unfolding right in front of her. Some of the neighbors were starting to notice the tension. A few tried to intervene, explaining the situation, but HOA Karen wasn't having it. "I don't care what's going on," she snapped. "Rules are rules. This tent has to come down, or I'll have it reported." Would the neighbors step up, or would this woman's obsession with rules derail everything? As the argument escalated, Officer Harris' fellow officers exchanged worried glances. Every minute that passed without a resolution meant less time searching for their missing colleague. One officer, clearly trying to stay calm, walked over to HOA Karen, speaking in a low voice. "Ma'am, this isn't just about a tent. An officer is missing. People's lives are at stake here." But Karen wasn't having it. She crossed her arms, her stance firm. "I don't care if he's missing or not. This is a violation of HOA rules, and I'm not backing down," she said, her voice unwavering. It felt like the walls were closing in, and the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. On the other side of the tent, a group of volunteers was doing their best to keep things moving. They were desperate to keep the search organized, but every distraction felt like a setback. A mother, a neighbor, stood near the group, holding her young son's hand. Her eyes were filled with worry. "Why is she doing this?" The woman whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Doesn't she understand what's going on?" Others in the neighborhood were starting to gather, some leaning toward the volunteers, trying to understand the gravity of the situation, while others were siding with Karen, worried about neighborhood rules. The community was divided. A young man stepped forward, his voice shaking but resolute. "We can't just let her ruin this. There's a life at risk. Don't we owe it to him to keep this search going?" But Karen remained unmoved, her eyes cold and calculating. She was used to getting her way, and the pressure only seemed to fuel her determination. As the standoff dragged on, the atmosphere grew more tense, with each passing minute feeling like a critical turning point. Would the community come together to support the search, or would Karen's relentless pursuit of rules tear them apart? The standoff between Karen and the volunteers was starting to feel like a ticking clock, with each second slipping away. adding more weight to the situation. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the scene, but the mood was anything but peaceful. Karen, still standing firm, glanced around, sensing that more and more people were beginning to side with the search effort. But that didn't stop her. "You all are making a mistake," she spat, her voice sharp. "This is about responsibility. You're breaking the rules, and I won't just stand by and let that happen." The officer who had been trying to reason with her stepped closer, his hand tightening on the radio clipped to his belt, the pressure mounting. His voice was more urgent now. "Ma'am, I need you to understand. There's an officer out there, my friend, and we need every resource to find him. This tent is critical. Please, just let us do our job." A few bystanders, who had been silently watching, now spoke up. "She doesn't get it," one of the neighbors muttered. "Doesn't she see what's happening here?" But even with more voices on the side of the volunteers, Karen remained unmoved, almost colder than before. The moment felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos, and no one knew how much longer they could hold out. The community was beginning to fracture. Some were siding with Karen, suggesting that she had a point about the rules, while others, like the young man who'd spoken up earlier, were urging for unity. "We can't afford to let her stop us," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "If we let her win, we might never find him." The volunteers exchanged nervous glances, trying to figure out what to do next. Time was slipping away, and with every minute that passed, the search grew more desperate. The officer closest to Karen was visibly shaking now, the pressure of the situation weighing heavily on him. He took a deep breath, glancing at his team, and nodded. It was clear they had no choice but to push back. But just as he opened his mouth to say something, a shout rang out from across the yard. It was the kind of shout that cut through the air, pulling everyone's attention. In that brief moment of silence, something shifted. Was it hope? Was it a sign that the search was finally making progress? Or was it just another desperate cry in a moment that was slipping further out of control? Everyone stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, waiting for what might come. The standoff was far from over, but something had changed. What would happen next would be the breaking point, and no one could predict which way it would go. The shout cut through the tension like a blade, drawing everyone's attention toward the edge of the neighborhood where a police cruiser had just screeched to a halt. The officer in charge of the search team froze. Was this it? Had they found something? Everyone held their breath as the vehicle doors slammed open. But as the officer stepped out, the expression on his face wasn't the one anyone was hoping for. It was a mix of frustration and disbelief, like he had just received terrible news. Behind him, another officer approached with a piece of paper in hand. They walked over to the group, and Karen, who had been standing with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold, turned her gaze sharply toward them. "What's going on?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. The officer with the paper paused, and in a heavy voice, he spoke. "We've just received word. Officer Harris' body has been found. The search is over." The words hung in the air, sending a shockwave through the crowd. For a brief moment, the world seemed to freeze. The volunteers who had been so committed to finding Harris, the neighbors who had been hoping for a miracle, all looked at each other in disbelief. Some were crushed, others in shock, but the reality had hit them all. The officer they had been desperately trying to save was gone. Karen stood motionless, her face unreadable. It was as if the weight of the situation suddenly shifted, but she didn't seem to register the gravity of the news right away. The officer continued, "We've recovered him, but now we have to focus on getting him home." It was at that moment when a second, even more unexpected twist came into play. The officer with the paper hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else. It wasn't an accident. Officer Harris was murdered." The crowd gasped in unison. The air around them felt like it had turned to ice. Karen, still caught in her own narrow focus, didn't seem to understand the full weight of what had just been revealed. Meanwhile, the others around her were gripped with a new fear. The search for a missing officer had turned into a murder investigation. Everything they thought they knew had just been shattered. Suddenly, the standoff felt trivial. The fight over the tent seemed insignificant compared to the tragedy unfolding. But it wasn't over, far from it. Everyone, from the neighbors to the volunteers to Karen herself, was now forced to confront a chilling truth. They weren't just fighting over rules anymore. The stakes had gotten much higher, and the mystery was just beginning to unfold. Who had killed Officer Harris? And what did the HOA Karen have to do with it, if anything? The revelation that Officer Harris had been murdered sent a shockwave through the neighborhood. But as the crowd began to digest the news, something else began to stir. The tension that had been building between Karen and the volunteers suddenly shifted. The focus was no longer on the tent or the rules. It was on the chilling murder that had just been uncovered. Karen stood there, staring at the officer in disbelief, her face pale, her usual confidence gone. The officer who had been talking looked at her with a strange intensity, almost as if he was searching for something. "We've got a lot of questions," he said, his tone low and purposeful, "and we're going to need everyone who's been involved to cooperate." For the first time, Karen's posture faltered. She glanced around, as though unsure whether to retreat into her shell or face the reality of what was unfolding. The officer's eyes didn't leave her, and in the silence that followed, the air grew thick with suspicion. One of the neighbors, a woman who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, stepped forward. Her voice was trembling but resolute. "Karen, you weren't just worried about the tent, were you? You knew something was off. You were in charge of organizing this community, weren't you?" Karen's eyes widened, but she quickly regained her composure. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, but her voice wavered. The officer spoke again, his voice cutting through her defenses. "You're part of a network, aren't you? One that Officer Harris was getting too close to." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "We've been looking into this, Karen. You knew the officer was about to expose something bigger, something you didn't want the public to know. It's not just about the HOA rules, is it?" A gasp swept through the crowd as the truth began to click into place. Karen had always been too invested in keeping her neighborhood perfect, too ready to enforce rules, even when lives were at stake. But it wasn't just about rules. It was about protecting something far darker. The officer continued, "You tried to stop the search because Harris was closing in on your operation. You didn't want the attention, and you knew the tent was the perfect distraction, but we've traced it all back to you." Karen's face twisted in anger, but there was no denying it now. She had been the one pulling strings behind the scenes, the one with the motive. The HOA rules, the complaints, everything. It had been a cover, a diversion to keep the search for the missing officer from getting too close to the truth. Just as she was about to open her mouth to deny everything, another officer stepped forward, holding up a phone with an image on the screen. It was a photo of Karen, meeting with a known criminal syndicate just days before Harris went missing. The final twist came with the next words out of the officer's mouth. "We've got everything we need, Karen. You're under arrest for the murder of Officer Harris." The crowd gasped in horror as Karen's face fell. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She was trapped. The fight over the tent, the ridiculousness of it all, had been a mask for a much darker truth.